friends of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Good morning and a warm welcome to this FIA event. My name is Matti Pesu. I'm a leading researcher at FIA's Finnish Foreign Policy, Northern European Security and NATO program. And I'm excited to chair today's extremely timely seminar on US grand strategy and Europe's role, the Rhine. This event is a joint effort by FIA's Center on US Politics and Power and the research project Finland's Evolving Role in Euro-Atlantic Security. The Russian full-scale attack against Ukraine has yet again demonstrated how pivotal role the US plays in European security. Its leadership has been essential in building and maintaining a united Western front against Russian aggression. Furthermore, the American security assistance to Ukraine has also been crucial in giving the Ukrainians the means to repel the Russian assault. Importantly, Washington has also reassured its European allies that it will defend every inch of NATO territory. And Finland's decision to join NATO indirectly or even directly reflects the assessment that the US is indeed seen as a credible patron committed to European security also in the long term. Having said that, the structural forces of international politics are inevitably shifting American attention to the Indo-Pacific region. The US National Defense Strategy clearly points out that whereas Russia is seen as an acute threat, China remains the pacing challenge to US security. And despite the recent dominance of European security on the US national security agenda, Europe is increasingly a secondary theater in the eyes of the United States. And it goes without saying that European allies and partners are carefully following how Europe's role evolves in US grand strategy. Today's seminar zooms in on the key questions currently animating US grand strategic debates against the backdrop of the Russian war of aggression and in anticipation of the approaching US presidential election season. In what ways might the contours of strategic competition between the US and its great power rivals, China and Russia, evolve? And what implications could this have for US allies and partners, including Finland? What are the prospects of US commitment to international institutions and free trade in the coming years? And how might the US prioritize between European and Indo-Pacific theaters in the future? I have now the privilege to introduce today's speakers. Our keynote speaker today is Professor Colin Dueck. He's one of the foremost intellectuals and thinkers of American foreign policy. Dr. Dueck is currently professor in the Schar School of Policy and Government at the George Mason University and a senior non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He studied politics at Princeton University and international relations at Oxford under a Rhodes Scholarship, and he has published 4 books on American foreign policy and national security policies. Welcome to Helsinki and FIA, Professor Dueck. It's an honor to have you with us today. I have also the pleasure to introduce you 2 of my brilliant colleagues. Dr. Ville Sinkkonen, he is a postdoctoral fellow at FIA's Center on US Politics and Power, and his research focuses on US foreign policy, great power politics, normative power, and the politics of trust in international relations. Minna Olander, she's a research fellow in the EU research program here at FIA, where her research focuses on German foreign and security policy, and she's also a frequent commentator on Finnish and Nordic security issues. So we will start off with Ville's opening presentation, and Ville's remarks are based on his new working paper, which was published yesterday, Ideational Trends in American Grand Strategy, Future Implications for Europe and Finland. And it's really an extensive review of American grand strategic debates and their implications for Europe. I strongly recommend you to read it. So Ville's remarks are then followed by Professor Dueck's keynote, and we will wrap up the presentation part with Minna's comments, and after which I open the floor for discussion. So, but without further ado, Ville, take it away.
Thank you, Matti. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, it's my pleasure to provide the opening remarks for today's event. before Professor Dueck, who's made a transatlantic journey to be with us today, and on a Friday no less. So thank you very much, Colin. I'll dive right into it. So following Hal Brand's, grand strategy can be broadly defined as the intellectual architecture that gives structure to foreign policy and helps nations find their way in the world. So studying grand strategy means paying attention to a country's perceptions of the international arena, its key relationships, and how it uses instruments of power in pursuit of key objectives. I would argue that discussions on American grand strategy are currently more contentious than at any other point since immediately after the end of the Cold War. This ideational ferment is driven by changes in the external environment, like the global power shift and challenges posed by China and Russia to the liberal rules-based order. But domestic dynamics also matter. There's decreased support for an active foreign policy after 2 decades of forever wars and deepening political polarization in the United States. Grand strategic debates are not only dusty academic undertakings. They tie the worlds of idea production and policy together by reacting to changes in the international and domestic environments that I just mentioned, and also to policy successes and failures. In the US, the debaters also often end up in key policymaking positions. So contestation over the fundamentals of US global engagement impact how the US will use its power in the future. So we in Europe should be paying close attention. In the paper, I argue that there's 3 ideational trends that currently define US grand strategic debates, and they're already having an impact on policy declaration and policy action. And these trends flow from 1, primacy to restraint, 2, internationalism to parochialism, and 3, from engagement to competition. Let me elaborate on this. So primacy, first off, has really been the default US approach to the world after World War II. It's entailed maintaining a global military footprint and alliance network, along with commitment to open trade, the institutions of the rules-based order, and core values. Recently, the idea environment has gradually moved from a bipartisan commitment to primacy towards restraint. Restraint is advocated by a broad group, including balance of power realists, libertarians on the right, and anti-imperialist liberals on the left. They call attention to the shifting global power balance, domestic resource constraints, and public opinion dynamics, and perceive an international order in crisis. So restrainers argue that the US can no longer afford to pursue primacy. They agree on the need to downsize America's military role, but they also put forward various options, ranging from an Asia-first approach to a full-scale pullback of America's global military presence. On the level of policy, the influence of restraint-oriented ideas is really most evident when it comes to military power and alliances. The 3 most recent presidential administrations have increasingly relied on precision strikes to combat terror threats and symbolic shows of force in reaction to spoiler regimes. The growing unwillingness to commit US ground troops culminated in the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but to the disappointment of restrainers, this has really not meant reductions in the defense budget. Restraint also has a political following on the progressive left and the conservative right, as I already mentioned. Progressive Democrats might like to rethink the NATO alliance. Europeans would replace current US capabilities on the continent, shed as opposed to share America's burdens. And some Republicans on the right might well do away with the alliance altogether. The second ideational trend is a shift from internationalism to parochialism. Primacist thinking has traditionally been divided between 2 schools: liberal internationalists, associated with the Democratic Party, and conservative internationalists with Republican leanings. Both favor robust global engagement. but the former have been more positively inclined towards international institutions and the promotion of certain liberal values than the latter. Now these approaches are being challenged from both the left and the right. Progressives on the left are not only critical of the militarization of US foreign policy, they also push for a broader reading of security that includes social justice and climate. They remain supportive of international institutions, but they stress links between domestic and foreign policy. And they also argue that neoliberal dogmas have adversely affected the American middle class. On the other side, conservative internationalists long kept the already mentioned restrainers and nationalists at bay. And we may hear more about this in Colin's remarks in due course. The nationalist strand, hyper-skeptical of international institutions and extremely protective of American sovereignty, has emerged as a potent force with Trump's rise and actually enjoys considerable support with the Republican base. The progressives and conservative nationalists are thus both critical of free trade, and this convergence has also manifested in the policies of the past two presidential administrations. There's more stylistic than substantive difference between Trump's America First trade policy and Biden's foreign policy for the middle class. Biden has kept most Trump-era tariffs against China in place. He's not re-engaged the CPTPP, and little progress has been made at the WTO appellate body. The subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, have raised eyebrows in Brussels. While Biden has returned the US to many of the multilateral fora that Donald Trump shunned, a drift towards more interest-based or tactical multilateralism through initiatives like the Quad and AUKUS continues. Now the third ideational trend goes from engagement to competition, and this in a sense transcends the first two trends. There's a growing consensus in Washington that the world has entered an era defined by great power or strategic competition. Pick your concept. With authoritarian great power challengers, China and Russia. Post-Cold War attempts to engage Beijing and Moscow and the liberal international order have become discredited. Given Donald Trump's obsession with competition, his administration was actually ideally placed to enact this final shift in both declaration and policy. In the foreign policy community more broadly, the convergence around great power or strategic competition has been swift and it has been bipartisan. Most mainstream foreign policy thinkers would probably agree that the notions describe well the current state of international relations, but many have also treated them as prescriptions to compete with challengers holistically. In hard security, this has meant growth in the defense budget and doubling down on alliance building. Biden's reaction to the war in Ukraine is a paramount example of America's still formidable ability to manage its alliances. In the economic realm, the change has been profound. Trump's tariffs on Chinese goods and pressure on allies to forego Chinese 5G technology have been followed by Biden's unprecedented restrictions on semiconductor exports to China. The US also continues to apply sanctions as a favorite economic tool, most notably against Russia. The Biden administration has also stressed the ideological component of the competition. The role of like-minded allies is key in what Biden views as a struggle for the future of international order. Beyond reinvigorating NATO and continuing the Trump-era commitment to the Quad, the US has elevated the role of the G7 and put together the first ever summit for democracy in December 2021. Yet this convergence around great power competition amongst both policymakers and analysts does not mean there is agreement over priorities, especially when it comes to Europe and the Indo-Pacific theaters, as Matti already mentioned. These discussions continue in the post-February 2022 world. And as Matti also mentioned, the current administration is treating Russia as the acute threat and China as the pacing challenge. But what do these trends really mean for the future? Taken together, they might ultimately produce a more resource-aware superpower, one that is willing to forego the views of allies for domestic and great power political reasons on a more regular basis. And this has implications for Europe. Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine has underlined the outsized security role of the US on the continent. However, in the medium to long term, it's unrealistic for allies to expect the US to take this level of responsibility for Europe's defense. China, not Russia, remains the long-term concern in Washington. So Europe must enhance its capabilities and do so with vigor. This would sell well both on the right and left of the American political spectrum and help keep the US involved in European security affairs in the future. This renegotiation of what Stanley Sloan calls the transatlantic bargain means developing some autonomous European capabilities in critical areas, and to do so even at the risk of duplication, the dreaded D word. This is a hedge against a still unlikely, substantial US withdrawal. At the same time, Europeans should remind the US of the importance of free trade and multilateral frameworks in a more competitive global environment. Through these actions, Europe would acquit itself as an actor as opposed to a bystander or object in a world of great power competition. Thank you for your attention, and I'll now yield the floor to our keynote speaker. Colin, please.
Thank you. First of all, I thought it was an excellent paper. Billy's paper was very astute. I can tell you from the point of view of a U.S. observer, I think he had a good feeling for American foreign policy trends. So some of what I say will at least dovetail with what he's described. It would probably be boring if I agreed with every single thing he said, so I'll pick on one little point, which is the word parochial. If you go back to George W. Bush's second inaugural 2005, it was this very ringing, sweeping, idealistic speech about the end of tyranny in our time. Even a lot of Republicans now, like myself, looking back to that speech, say, "Man, that was probably a bit much, actually." And I think most Americans have decided that that was a mistake, that the war in Iraq was a mistake. So, if the reaction to that is to be a little more parochial, that's not entirely a bad thing. In other words, if we're turning from an approach that's extremely militant, universalistic, sweeping, idealistic, towards something a little more concrete, a little more modest, a little more material, that's okay, actually. Then the question is, how do we avoid overcorrecting in the other direction? And that's been a problem more than once, right? Regardless of administration. So how do we, throw out the bathwater without throwing out the baby? That's been the challenge in the last 15 years with American grand strategy. So let me speak about that. I think one way to think about post-Cold War American grand strategy is that there really used to be a bipartisan consensus, and you can document this looking at national security strategies from one administration to the next, that great powers of the world would converge on a single model, which was a market-oriented democratic model friendly to the United States. And this is in writing, so don't take my word for it. Go back and read the national security strategies of Barack Obama, George W. Bush, his father, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton. They all say in writing the same thing, which is we expect the great powers of the world, including Russia and China, to converge in a single direction. Okay? The first administration to actually break with that was the Trump administration, which said in writing, we don't believe that anymore. That's over. We don't think it's realistic. Now, in 2023, that's the conventional wisdom. It didn't work. It failed. Convergence didn't happen. It didn't happen in the case of Russia. It didn't happen in the case of China. It's probably not going to happen anytime soon, and we have to get real and understand that as a conceptual premise for our approach. So that's actually something useful that the people in the Trump administration did, for all the criticisms of it. And you'll notice that the Biden administration hasn't altered that. Right? So if you look at the Biden administration's national security strategy from just a few months ago, they absolutely accept the premise that China is First of all, that there is such a thing as great power competition that's resurfaced, that China is the number one long-term problem, that Russia is a very serious problem that they think is even more urgent in the short term. So this is a trend just exactly as you heard. That's true. There is a reduction in the belief that the great powers of the world will converge, and there is a fresh belief across party lines that great power competition is back. So that's trend number one. And I wouldn't even say it's not simply an ideational trend. It's a real trend. It's a geopolitical trend that's been recognized in American thinking. Okay, second, closely related, a trend from free trade to protection. This is also bipartisan, just as you heard. Again, the post-Cold War assumption in the US was a kind of neoliberal, the world is flat. I think it was Thomas Friedman who said globalization, economic interdependence. Any country that has a McDonald's will not fight with another country that has a McDonald's. This is all very encouraging, and we'll all get along, I'm sure, as long as we engage in free trade and free flows of finance and commerce. Optimistic. This was never uncontested. There were always those out there who critiqued it from left and right. And of course, the World Trade Organization, you had a breakdown really in global talks. So that's long-standing. You had Bush 43 shifting toward a more regional or bilateral approach as opposed to a global approach to trade agreements. You had Barack Obama kind of foot-dragging on TPP. So, there have been warning signs for many years. But I think, at least at the level of ideas in Washington, D.C., there was, right up until 2015, an ideational dominance of the idea that free trade would be best worldwide. And one of the things that I can tell you from working on other Republican campaigns, for example, 2008 or 12, was that was actually how we approached things. I mean, for example, looking at China, the typical Republican candidate would say, we think that the Democrats are insufficiently strong on China, on military matters or strategic matters, but really we don't object to free trade with China. I mean, that was sort of walled off, right? And what Donald Trump did when he famously came down the elevator in summer 2015 is he identified a weakness, which he's often pretty good at. He identified a gap between the way that a lot of blue-collar Republicans feel on this issue of free trade or trade with China, and the way that Republican elites felt, who, after all, had not been personally or materially hurt by free trade with China, just the opposite. And he recognized that there was this gap, and then he kind of drove a truck through it, right? And so as it turns out, half the Republican Party is much more ambivalent or even opposed to free trade with China, and that became painfully obvious, and he made it a winning issue for himself. He made it a winning issue, actually, to the surprise of a lot of us in 2016. It certainly didn't hurt him to make that a full-throated argument. And if you think about it more generally, that's how a lot of Democrats feel. I mean, the Democratic Party had always had a base of support, especially on the left, that had concerns about free trade for reasons of environment, human rights, organized labor. What Trump did, which was very interesting politically, is to outflank Hillary Clinton right across the spectrum on the issue of trade, so that he outflanked her from a protectionist argument. And this was a vote-winning issue, I can tell you, in key states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and the Rust Belt. One of the reasons that people think he beat Clinton in 2016 was this issue. There's a lot of things we talk about that are not vote-winning issues when it comes to foreign policy. This is an issue that actually has an effect, is free trade versus protection. So now everybody has seen that on both sides of the line and is responding accordingly. And we can say that in the abstract, most Americans like free trade and they think it's great. But for whatever reason, politicians don't agree with the academic or the think tank perception. They seem to believe that free trade is not a winning issue. So we can lecture them about the winning politics of free trade, but that's not how they see it. What most Democrats and most Republicans in Washington, D.C. think is that the American public isn't especially enthusiastic about the latest idea for a big free trade agreement. And that is a reflection of what Trump did. Okay, again, for better or worse, I'm not saying this is a positive thing, I'm saying it's the reality. It's the political reality in Washington. And that also changed the conversation, so that now I think there is a widespread recognition on both sides of the aisle that free trade with China didn't work. It didn't work. On balance, there were some serious downsides from the point of view of American security, human rights, the fact that China got rich without getting less authoritarian, and actually for American workers inside the United States. I mean, there are jobs that have been lost over the years, and a lot of communities sort of went in a deindustrialized direction, and that's largely for domestic or technological reasons, but trade with China had something to do with it. So this has changed the conversation. So for all the critique of the Trump administration on this issue, you know, as you just heard, the Biden team hasn't rejected it entirely, right? You have a different kind of approach. You have a polite protectionism. It's less rude, but it's not a reversion to free trade. It's not a reversion to the world is flat. The Biden team actually can be quite assertive, as I'm sure you know in the EU, on looking out for what they think U.S. economic interests are. They have a different way of talking about it. They haven't dismantled China tariffs. I think probably Bill is being polite when he talks about raised eyebrows on the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it was much more than raised eyebrows, right? So there is this sense that the Biden team has incorporated and digested and continued some of the most important changes from the Trump years on trade. Of course, it's not waging to quite the same spectacular extent these full-blown trade wars that we saw between Donald Trump and, you know, key allies, I mean, Mexico and Canada, Europe, Northeast Asia. But the foreign policy for the middle class is a polite way of saying we are not going back. We're not going back to a 1990-style free trade consensus. Personally, I actually think it would be good if we had a U.S. Re-engagement, for example, with the renegotiated version of TPP. I mean, that would make sense given if you really think China is your number one challenge, you should be doing that. But I'm not sure it makes sense politically. Okay, so just to be blunt. The third trend, reduced appetite for optional military interventions overseas. You know, again, compared to the peak of 20 years ago, the George W. Bush era with Iraq and Afghanistan simultaneously. This really begins with Obama, of course, 2008. Barack Obama comes in and says, you know, Iraq was a mistake. And that didn't hurt him in 2008. On balance, it probably helped him. It certainly helped him in the Democratic primary, and I think arguably it helped him in the general election. So the idea that Iraq didn't go as planned, but now, looking back in the last 15 years, Libya also did not go as planned, 2011, and frankly, Afghanistan did not go as planned. And you would think of those three, Afghanistan's the one that initially had over 90% popular support, directly related to 9/11. There was not much criticism of the war in Afghanistan in the United States in the fall of 2001. I mean, very, very rare. So people who now claim they were against it, I would go back and double check that. But, you know, looking back over the last 20 years, something went wrong, and this is tragic. It has been terrible to watch. But I can tell you there's a whole generation. I teach at a university where I've taught many students, thousands of students over the last 20 years, graduate and undergraduate, and now a whole generation of Americans have no living experience of a successful U.S. military intervention overseas. The only lived experience they have is of unsuccessful U.S. military interventions. So that's not my own experience. I'll date myself and tell you, you know, I remember in the 1980s there was it was controversial, but you at least had the impression that the United States was kind of pushing back against Soviet influence, and then at the end of that decade, you had a surprisingly positive outcome, the collapse of the Soviet bloc. So that seems to vindicate the notion you can do some good in the world, if not through direct intervention, then at least through a more robust national security policy. That's my personal experience. But you know, I'm getting gray, as you can see from my beard, and there are now many Americans who have no such experience. So that's important. The Cold War is now a memory. It is a memory for many of these people, and they are going to continue rising in Congress and in think tanks and in other important venues. So that's a bipartisan trend, and that's left and right. And again, this was another surprise from the Trump era. However people think about his personality, I mean, when he said in the fall of 2015, I think it was one of those presidential debates with Jeb Bush at the time. And Trump openly said, I remember it very distinctly, because again, I was actually working for another candidate. And Trump said Iraq was a mistake. And he actually sounded kind of angry when he said it, right? And all the other candidates were like, this is outrageous. You're a Republican. You can't say that. That's not allowed. How can the prominent Republican candidate say Iraq was a mistake? Well, again, didn't hurt him. As it turns out, a lot of grassroots Republicans felt that it was a mistake. And even a certain percentage of soldiers and Marines who returned from Iraq and Afghanistan felt that it was a mistake. So as it turns out, a good percentage, not necessarily a majority, but a large percentage of Republican grassroots voters on reflection felt that Iraq was a mistake. Again, that was not supposed to be the Republican position. We were supposed to be the hawkish party, the more interventionist party militarily. So Trump there again identified a gap between Republican elites and the base and went through it. And it didn't hurt him. And now I think it's conventional wisdom Iraq was a mistake. I mean, that's not especially controversial thing to say, right? Even people, even staunch I have friends who are, staunch neoconservative thinkers who now will say, actually, yeah, it was a mistake. These are some of the most vocal people who advocated it in 2003. So now that's changed. More generally, you're going to tend to find a skepticism about the possibility of use of force, period. Even in Ukraine, there's going to be some Americans who say, I mean, do we really want to risk conflict with Russia by just continually going up the ladder of escalation? I mean, isn't this sort of what we saw didn't work in Iraq? That might not make sense, but that is a common view. So that's the third. Fourth, deepening political polarization. By the way, just stop me if I talk too long. Okay. Deepening political polarization. This is clearly a trend compared to 30 years ago. And, I mean, I have to tell you, you may have some sense of this from across the Atlantic, but it would be difficult to exaggerate the level of bad feeling inside Washington, D.C. between the two political parties. It's intense. We talk about historically the era of good feeling. I think the early 1800s were an era of good feeling with presidents like James Monroe. We are now in an era of bad feeling, okay? It's official. The level of mutual antipathy is intense. I mean, literally at the level of individuals in D.C. who just won't even communicate with each other inside Congress, particularly the House of Representatives. They will not work together. And then at the level of voters, when you ask the general public, what do you think the greatest threats are to the United States? The top three threats for each party, you'll typically get, Russia and China in there. One of the top three threats that Democrats think of is the Republican Party. And by the way, the feeling's mutual. Most Republicans will say that one of the three greatest threats to the United States is the Democrats. So both parties view one another as deadly threats to American democracy. At least there's a great many voters who see it that way. That is not a positive trend, but that's where we're at as a country. It's very different from a generation or two ago. And that's going to affect your American grand strategy. It cannot help but have spillover effects. Of course, it makes it hard to have anything remotely resembling a bipartisan approach. You may get moments where you get a significant group from the other party coming and supporting a piece of legislation on the merits, but the basic assumption is one of opposition, mutual opposition. And I'm not sure that I don't see any sign of that reversing anytime soon. So it has other effects as well, which is the two parties are more and more lined up ideologically against one another, left versus right. And that's actually that wasn't quite so true a generation ago. So you tend to see very little overlap, for example, in Congress. It used to be that you would have more of a senator like West Virginia's Jim Manchin. There would be more individuals like that who were kind of in the middle, overlapping, liberal Republicans, conservative Democrats. There's very few today. So your typical member of Congress who's Democrat is liberal, left of center. Your typical one on the Republican side is right of center, and there's just not much overlap. So ideologically, that's important. And that's also going to feed into the difficulty of U.S. formulating anything resembling a bipartisan U.S. grand strategy. Just to give you further examples, climate change, right? Do you think of climate change as a top national security issue? Democrats say yes, Republicans say no. There is no agreement on that issue, not at the level of members of Congress, not at the levels of the voting public. Conversely, do you think of illegal immigration into the United States as a top national security issue? Republicans say yes, Democrats say no. There's no agreement on that. So that's another example of an issue where you're just not going to get agreement. And then on this particular point, I would also add that the way the two parties think about international organizations and multilateral institutions has also become more polarized. I would say for Democrats, whether progressive or center-left, there is almost a kind of theological commitment, the idea being that multilateral institutions are absolutely worthwhile, almost an end in themselves, but they certainly are a useful tool for U.S. grand strategy. Whereas for conservatives, I think there's much more skepticism, and that has only grown over time. So part of what you're seeing on the right is increased skepticism as to the utility of multilateral institutions. And that is very real, and that has deep roots in American history. I'm not sure it's going away, so I would keep an eye on that as well. So all of which is to say, this is not your grandfather's American grand strategy. It is not the Dwight Eisenhower 1950s, we'll all sort of get along and figure it out. You're seeing a shift, and deepening partisan polarization in the United States is going to have an effect on that. Okay, fifth, the final trend, the rise of China. Of course, this is the single biggest geopolitical trend. I think everybody kind of knows it now in Washington. There's disagreement on what exactly to do about it, but this has certainly sunk in. The idea being that if you have a peer competitor, which we've never had before, the United States has never had, in its modern history, an authoritarian competitor with a GDP roughly comparable to its own. Neither Germany nor the Soviet Union ever had this kind of range of economic capabilities. So at a certain point, you've got to get serious and figure out how do you tackle this challenge. Both parties, I think, now recognize this. That has sort of been working its way through the American system for years now. If you go back, even before 9/11, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld in 2001 was actually talking about sort of a shift toward Asia in terms of U.S. defense priorities. Of course, that was then derailed because of 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and President Bush made it clear that he had other priorities. And then when Obama came in, right, you remember the pivot to Asia. So we were going to have a pivot to Asia. But then, as presidents often find, events occur, right? Things pop up in the Middle East. You have the Arab Spring. You don't want to completely walk away from Europe. So Obama was actually criticized for the pivot to Asia. And in a way, it was never fully resourced. I mean, we were actually cutting the Navy while we were talking about pivot to Asia, which doesn't exactly add up. So that was the problem under Obama. But there was at least a recognition that this is a long-term trend. And then again, strangely enough, with Trump, for all of his idiosyncratic qualities, the pivot to Asia continues, right? So we have all these rambunctious disagreements over how exactly to do it inside the United States. But there is this now over 20-year trend where we are pivoting to Asia. And this is going to continue. This is absolutely going to continue. I think you see it again with, you saw it very explicitly with the key documents of the Trump era, that it was, we will be pivoting to the Indo-Pacific, and we're going to prioritize that. And I think that's also continuing under Biden. For all of the obvious changes, there are these more subtle continuities underneath the surface, and then that raises some serious questions. I'm sure we'll talk more about what does that mean for Europe? What does that mean for American alliances in Europe, right? If you're pivoting to Asia because of this kind of domineering material challenge emanating from Beijing. Okay, so then what I'll just conclude with is the thought that while there are these 5 trends that look very much like the ones you heard, there's also counter trends. Every one of these 5 points has the possibility of a counteracting movement. So first of all, great power competition. Yes, we are in an era of great power competition. At the same time, I think we've seen in recent years that in some ways there's been a strengthening or a solidification of great power cooperation between the world's leading democracies. So just this last year, it's been gratifying to see the strengthening of NATO. However we think about whether you think of the EU as a great power or a collection of powers, there certainly has been that solidifying effect. And in relation to Japan and India, U.S. relations with Japan and India have only gotten better over the years, almost regardless of administration. And you're talking about very robust democracies in the case of those 2 Asian powers that has wide bipartisan support inside the United States. There's a lot of enthusiasm in the U.S. in both parties for strong relations with India and Japan, regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat. So that's a possibility that counteracts great power competition. Second, on increased protectionism, look, there is the possibility of a more pro-trade, kind of active, bold pro-trade agenda if a U.S. president actually picked it up and championed it, made it a priority, was willing to take the risk or pay the price. I admit that it's a heavy lift politically, but I think it's possible depending on the circumstances. Maybe we'll talk more about that. The third, on the point about anti-interventionism, This really depends on events, you know, and I think you've seen over this last year, there was a surge of support for U.S. aid to Ukraine, even though it carried certain risks. That was unexpected. We wouldn't have thought 2 or 3 years ago that this was even a possibility. But now you have solid American support. If you look at the American public as a whole, there is a solid majority to this day supports U.S. arms to Ukraine and U.S. sanctions against Ukraine in combination with European allies. I would also say in other regions, you know, in the Middle East in relation to Iran, and above all in relation to China, in potential hotspots like Taiwan, there are contingencies that could actually provoke U.S. intervention or even military action, depending on the situation, depending on the president. If we were to have this conversation talking about long-term trends in 1938, you would say rising isolationism as you know, as the world goes to hell. And then in 1942, it looks very different. Okay, so I'm not hoping we repeat that experience, but I would just say that I often tell students in the United States that Americans go to war regularly. It's the truth. I mean, we go to war. We intervene militarily. We're always intervening somewhere militarily. I don't say this to celebrate it. It is not at all impossible for me to imagine that whatever trends have occurred against optional military interventions, that you could have a combination of scenarios, especially over Taiwan, that could actually rally a majority of Americans behind a president willing to act militarily. Okay, that's not necessarily a happy thought, but I think it's entirely possible, and that could change things very suddenly. So there's a fluidity to this, including on the Republican side. So keep an eye on Taiwan especially, and for what that means to Europe. The fourth point about polarization, I don't expect this to go away, but again, for the reason I just described, you can imagine contingencies whereby Americans could overcome their polarization on specific issues. And in a way, we already are in some sort of low-key ways. I mean, if you think about it in Congress, there's a new select committee led by Congressman Mike Gallagher, Republican from Wisconsin, that's going ahead on China issues very assertively, and that really is bipartisan. I mean, there's a lot of support in both parties in Congress for some pretty robust measures against China. I mentioned India and Japan. If you look at NATO expansion, I think the vote in the Senate, there was a single vote against it, right? That's bipartisan. So you can have, in discrete areas, you can have U.S. foreign policy or grand strategy moving forward with a lot of support in both parties, regardless of the overall bad feeling, okay? That you don't necessarily need to overcome it to have concrete achievements. And then finally, China. A lot of my colleagues at AAI, the think tank American Enterprise Institute, actually believe that Chinese growth may be peaking and even declining. So again, as we have these conversations about inevitable trends, we tend to think that whatever trend has occurred over the last 30 years will just continue forever. Rising isolationism, rising protectionism, rising China, whatever it is. Again, there is a possibility that despite China's incredible achievements over the last 40 years, whatever it is, economically, that we've already seen growth slowing, that may continue to slow, and that if anything, the danger might be that Beijing is tempted to seize this window of opportunity to be more aggressive, precisely because the future looks daunting from a Chinese point of view. That might actually be our #1 challenge, but the idea that China will just continually overpass and race past the United States economically may not be true. So I would say overall, you know, trends are worth discussing, but after all, you know, events matter, contingencies matter, leadership matters. These things can change very quickly. And in the United States, we've seen, you know, in recent years this repeatedly. We wouldn't have predicted the we wouldn't have predicted the Russian invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago. We wouldn't have predicted Donald Trump being elected President of the United States spring, had we been sitting here, 8 years ago. We wouldn't have predicted 9/11 in Iraq 22 years ago. So I would say expect the unexpected, and you know, be open to different possibilities as opposed to just inevitabilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you for these very insightful inputs. I would like to pick up some things from both of you that you mentioned. Like I have, of course, read Ville's briefing paper with great interest, and it was very insightful for me as a non-US expert. So I'm going to look at all of this from a European perspective, because obviously we are already getting very nervous about next year's elections, presidential elections, and how big how big the trouble will be for us, in which we will find ourselves, depending on the outcome of the elections. So obviously, as has been stated here already, that like Russia's war in Ukraine has made it very painfully clear how very dependent Europe is at the moment still on the US, especially in terms of security and defense. So I think there are reasons to be nervous. So I would like to pick up some things, just as one comment, because I was supposed to comment. So I think one very interesting thing that came from both of you was like this fact that there's actually quite a lot of continuity all the way from Obama through Trump to Biden. And I think that in Europe, because of our kind of myopic Eurocentrism, we are not really very good at seeing through this polarization, which was also mentioned. So we are kind of thinking that there's this extreme volatility from one administration to the next, and that gives us no expectation security, and in general makes life hard on the transatlantic issues. So I think this is a very good thing to emphasize, that what we need to do is to see beyond some of the rhetoric and really look at what is the policy to understand the US better, and to be better at kind of like somewhat, even if we expect the unexpected, but to like somewhat like have a feeling that there's some control over this. And then I would like to ask Ville, first of all, is there really anything new about this? Like, isn't this like what you define as primacy and then restraint or parochialism? Isn't this like a very, very, very long-standing, like centuries-old feature of U.S. foreign policy? Like this kind of alteration between internationalism and isolationism. Colin just picked it up about like between the world wars, we were in this situation. I wouldn't go as far as to say that we are back in the same situation as between the world wars. I at least don't hope so. But I think there is like remarkable consistency as well in U.S. foreign policy with this regard. Then, like one thing that I would like to disagree with you on is that you suggest in your briefing paper that European states should also kind of show commitment or like engage in the Indo-Pacific to an extent. You do mention the caveat that to an extent that it makes sense, and that is a very important point. I still think that because we have now seen in all clarity how European states just like lack pretty much everything in terms of military capabilities. Nobody really has anything, which is a huge problem now with the support of Ukraine, and that is why Ukraine is so dependent on the US support in the end. So I would argue against that maybe it's better that Europeans just try to get serious about our own defense, so that then maybe like burden sharing becomes a reality, and then the US has more own capacity to focus on the Indo-Pacific. I'm sure that France and UK to some extent are willing to still have, like France, for example. It's interesting to see how or whether European security policies and defense planning is changing now as a result of all this. And in France, for example, they are now putting more money into it, but not changing, for example, the general force model of their armed forces, which will stay this expeditionary type. So I'm sure that France definitely continues to have these kind of global ambitions. UK is an interesting example because I think global Britain came back to Europe and became a very European Britain again, and is very much focused on Northern European security, and that is, I think, a very welcome development. And I think what comes to Germany, the third like larger European country, which is now like reorienting its security and defense thinking, what we should definitely try and stop is Germany. Like there was this idea that Germany should send a corvette to the Indo-Pacific, and a German corvette in the Indo-Pacific like could be a nice symbolic gesture, but not more than that. And I think that we should keep the few German corvettes that are there, preferably in the Baltic Sea. So there are definitely limits to, especially what you also mentioned, Ville, that like to what extent it makes sense that European states kind of pick this up. And from the Finnish perspective, and this is also something that you mentioned, and this I completely agree with you on, that for Finland, for example, will be the best ally if we just like focus on what we're good at, and that's like regional defense and like regional security in up here, and we can, for example, help countering China in the Arctic. Because the US has made quite clear that while it will not scale down its presence in the Arctic, it also won't scale it up. And there is a very strong and clearly expressed expectation that European and regional allies will take up some responsibility up here and in the Arctic, and that is like kind of up to us to show that we can handle our region. So then, like one thing that I would like to just bring into the discussion from the European perspective is the debate about European strategic autonomy, which is very much linked to the US and how the US will develop. Like what will the next administration look like and everything. I think it can't be like overemphasize how big a trauma the Trump administration is for the Europeans, and it's a great. It was a lucky coincidence in a way that Biden happened to be president now that we have this war on the European continent, and Biden as a president has been like extraordinarily accommodative towards the Europeans, especially the Germans, and I think that. For example, German Chancellor Scholz has been very good at using this to the fullest, because Biden has been obviously in very much a damage control mode after Trump. Like he's very aware how bad that experience was and everything. But then the one thing that is particularly bitter is that Trump wasn't wrong about everything what comes to and I think there's this I will never forget this one video clip from a United Nations, I think General Assembly or something, where Trump is blasting Germany over Nord Stream, and German diplomats are laughing in a very smug fashion. And the fact that of all people in the end Trump was right on this issue is very, very bitter. For the Germans and for Europeans in general. And so this is something that is kind of difficult right now in the relations, I think, of the biggest European states. My own specialty is Germany, so that's what I know best. Like France is anyways always kind of like, France doesn't want too much US in Europe. France wants Europe to be more French than American, and that's why this European strategic autonomy is a very very French concept in a way. Macron is a strong advocate of it, and on paper and officially Germany too. But then it was very interesting, for example, like we have seen it in the weapons deliveries to Ukraine, that Germany and Scholz has been very careful to always pair it with a similar commitment from the US. So Germany has de facto not delivered anything without the US delivering a similar equivalent weapons system, and it was the same again with the main battle tanks, as we saw. So while Scholz has been saying that Germany is not going it alone and only with partners, he kind of like called his own bluff with this and showed that actually what this means is that Germany is not going to move an inch without the US holding its hand. So this is not exactly the French understanding of European strategic autonomy, and I think it has become very clear that that this strategic autonomy is at best at this moment a very distant ambition. And this is maybe where then the opinions really differ, like in the Nordic countries and also in the Baltics, Central Eastern European countries. The US is a very important security partner, and there is this realization that we need the US and we need to secure long-term US commitment rather than try and get independent of it, because it's just not realistic in the short or medium term. So I think that everyone in Europe agrees on the fact that we do need to be more able to defend ourselves, and we can't entirely depend on the US like we have done so far. I think it's very interesting that actually of the countries like Germany and France are the loudest advocates of European strategic autonomy, but they are actually the ones like kind of doing the least or have been like doing the least to actually achieve it. I think that, for example, in Finland, there's a very strong awareness, and in general in the Nordic countries, that if we want to secure United States long-term engagement and commitment to this region, we have to show that we are able and willing to do our part, and that we're not just going to expect the US to come and save us if push comes to shove. So I think this is maybe better understood in the, let's say, northern and eastern part of Europe, that Poland is also massively ramping up its capacities, and that doesn't go unnoticed in the US. So I think there is more of this understanding that we need to do more in order to keep the US in Europe. And France and Germany, or especially France, would probably like to see more like we need to do more so that we don't need the US so much in Europe. So this is quite a big difference, and where there's not really a clear vision in Europe yet. And that is also the one thing that has kind of like kept the European Union common security and defense policy kind of underdeveloped, that there's just like not really a shared strategic vision. So that's that from me, and I will just then like maybe ask one question from Colin, and that is, so you mentioned this era of bad feeling, and that is, I think, a very good way of describing it, unfortunately. But like my question is to you, how to make the political center great again?
Well, I wouldn't count on it. I think that all the trends inside the U.S. are headed in the opposite direction, because the long-term trend has been, you can actually map this out. I mean, political scientists have tried to do it quantitatively, and they've showed that there's been a movement among both members of Congress and voters toward a more conservative Republican Party, especially on cultural issues, and a more liberal Democratic Party, again, especially on cultural issues. And so we've seen at times in American history where the leading issue is economic, it's a little bit easier to compromise or negotiate. You might say, well, capital gains tax should be this instead of that, and you can sort of split the difference. If it's a fundamental cultural difference about what it means to be an American, that's harder to negotiate. So when you see the culture wars, so-called culture wars, these might seem trivial or silly from the other side of the planet, but they really don't seem that from point of view of most Americans, left and right, who actually think they're deadly serious, right? I mean, basic issues, for example, how are your children raised in school? What are they taught about American history? This goes to the heart of it, right? Parents are going to want to know what their kids are learning in school, and whether those parents are progressive or conservative, whether they are, for example, devout Christian or not, they're going to be keenly interested in what their kids are being taught in school. That's going to be hard to just have a compromise deal. So I think the real positive possibility isn't so much that you're going to see this reconstituted center, a sort of new Dwight Eisenhower, a new conservative Democrat or a new liberal Republican. I think that's very unlikely under current conditions. I think you're going to have to figure out ways to work around it when it comes to the issues of U.S. grand strategy that affect you in Finland and in Europe. But I do think it's possible in the U.S. to imagine issue areas where you can find cooperation on those issues, regardless of the bigger cultural conflicts that are honestly are not going to go away anytime soon.
Thank you. Professor Dueck. Ville, do you want to respond to some of Minna's views and comments?
Minna, thank you, as expected. Extremely astute remarks. You touched on the continuity Obama, Trump, Biden. That's sort of the point I was trying to make, and I'm glad you picked up on it, because there is that trend, and it's not only ideational; it's also, of course, political. But that's an important point. Internationalism versus isolationism, yes, obviously, but these trends, of course, unfold differently at different stages in history. But there is, of course, this pulling and hauling between a more internationalist and a more isolationist United States. I mean, Charlie Kupchan just wrote a book on isolationism a couple of years ago, and you know, he touches on this at length, and you know, it's a very in vogue issue to be discussing at the moment. Commitment to the Indo-Pacific, yeah, I said to the extent that it's rational for Europe, and what is politically and militarily rational is not always the same thing. And, you know, so there might be a point to sending that corvette to the Indo-Pacific if it looks like you're signaling commitment to your ally, even if it's, you know, not in the Baltic for that couple of months, that it's in the Indo-Pacific. So there is that counter argument to it. What else? European strategic autonomy. Yeah, I think it comes down to the quintessential paradox in transatlantic security relations. So, which has been the issue for, you know, especially American transatlanticists for decades. You know, you want Europe to do more, but you want Europe to do more in a way that the United States wants. You know, and that, I think, is the key issue, and I think that's changing to an extent. I noted that, you know, some progressives will talk about, you know, burden shedding as opposed to burden sharing, and, you know, and duplication is not as dirty a word anymore as it used to be, for Madeleine Albright, for instance. So clearly, you know, this whole discussion is changing in that regard. So those are my brief reflections on Minna's remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ville, and thank you, our panelists, for offering excellent views on the foreign policy and national security landscapes in the US and Europe. But at this point, I'm looking at our distinguished audience for questions and your views. So, yeah, first, Madam Ambassador, and then Kari Möttölä, and then Ambassador Nyberg for the first round. And we have, say, 25 minutes, so at least maybe for 2 rounds. So, but yeah.
Yes, thank you, Matti and Fia. Once again, I'm the ambassador of Chile to Finland and Estonia, so thank you so much. The paper was very enlightening, you know, seeing it, reading it from this part of the world, so thank you, Ville. And I have just a question and probably a comment. You talk about this tactical multilateralism, which obviously Colin also has, you know, tackled in some of his, you know, arguments. So if you can deliver a little bit more, because what we have been seeing is that the US constantly, you know, engages in this tactical multilateralism. Now with AUKUS, we see it also in these particular agencies in the UN, for example, UNICEF. Now we have Cindy McCain taking over the World Food Program, which is very strategic in this day and time. So if you can deliver a little bit more, and wouldn't it be probably positive if there was a kind of a shift, because as we see the contrast between the P5 multilateralism approach, and obviously also Finland, which is very much engaged in a very, you know, let's say silent way. So wouldn't be that a good way forward? Maybe, you know, just to, if you oversee a shift in this, just from the tactical to a more maybe, you know, universal approach. And then I would want to ask Colin on the candidates that are, you know, beginning to run for the, and as Minna has pointed, you know, there's a concern here. So if you can deliver a little bit more, if maybe actors like Nikki Haley from the Republican side that has, you know, a multilateral experience, do you think that that would be a positive in the element in the discussion? So yeah, thank you.
Professor Möttölä and then Ambassador Nyberg.
I would like to say a concept here which seems like having been thrown in the wastebasket. Liberal international order. It's not disappeared anywhere as a theoretical or academic concept or even a political concept. because it doesn't mean, liberal international mean military misadventures. In the main point, there is the democratic society in each of these countries, which entail the liberal international order. It's shrinking a little bit, but not. That's why it's interesting. Ville's paper actually tells us that United States strategy entails these three drivers in various combinations. Like Colin actually said, they can go the other way around. And I can tell to Colin that your colleague and leader at the American Enterprise, Cory Shake, just the other day said that he's a fan of John Eikenberry. He believes in liberal international order. This conservative internationalism that Republicans perhaps represent as opposed to liberal internationalism has different forms. And isn't what the US is now doing vis-a-vis Ukraine to save Ukraine to be a part of liberal international order, actually? And I think this tells, if you use this kind of narrative, that's something that politicians in Europe wants to know. That's what we are doing, actually.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the panel and the most instructive discussion. And I liked Ville's paper, I have to say that. Now, let me say, I'm a great admirer of Timothy Snyder, Yale University and Vienna. And I've been working, well, I met him, and his main works have been translated into Finnish. And I have to say that he actually summarized something which I think still stands. He said that China is peaking, Russia is declining, and Trump is done. But my comment actually is that is there something new in what we've seen now? Of course, the war in Ukraine is not, we haven't seen the end of it. But there's something new in the way the United States has used intelligence information. There's kind of a weaponizing of intelligence information, if you can say that you weaponized your own intelligence. But the way it was used to counter Putin's trolling. We're talking about the autumn of 2021, when Putin was trolling us all, requiring немедленно security guarantees and kind of painting a threat which didn't exist. And he misled us. The only thing he was thinking about and the only thing he was talking about was Ukraine. And the way the American administration used intelligence information in kind of pulling the rug under him was unprecedented. And it had a certain, well, of course it helped the Ukrainians in the first place. But the second thing is that the United States is redoing it today with China. And it might just work. It just might work. I've never seen that before, and I think this is a kind of an escalation, and it's a new world. Well, now to Professor Colin Duck's point of military success. Well, killing Bin Laden was a military success, and it's one of the I mean, the film and all of that. And the second thing is, of course, you said it yourself that sanctions have been against Russia have been working and enjoy support. But HIMARS, if you look at those endless Russian talk shows, the HIMARS are part of that talk show. It's kind of all jokes and all arguments. I mean, HIMARS is so. Yes, the American military assistance and the weapon systems have played a role. And I think just think about the fact that I haven't been able to ask any Indians what they think about the fact that they are almost totally dependent on Russian arms. I mean, if we've seen something is the loss of the honor of Russian arms industry, the total superiority of anything the Western world has produced in armaments is one of the outcomes of this war, and it kills the Russian arms export industry for many decades to come. So this was my point. Now Scholz and Germany. Minna is an expert. We share a love to Germany here. Scholz spoke yesterday in the Bundestag. It was the most muscular speech a German chancellor has. Well, it might be ever said. I mean, I was quite impressed. I listened to it and read it, and then he said, and tonight I'm flying to Washington. He's flying to Washington, not with a delegation. He's flying to Washington to speak tête-à-tête with Biden. There are new elements coming into the war in Ukraine, and the German Free the Leopards. We saw that show of Free the Leopards. The fact is that the leopards were not coming because all of those who wanted to deliver a leopard said they're ready to deliver these leopards were not that ready when it came to it. But there's something quite interesting in this German-American relations, which will change Germany and hopefully the course of the war in Ukraine.
Thank you. So we had questions on multilateralism, coming US elections, liberal international order, and then the novelties and successes in the US recent approach to war in Ukraine and European security, and then on German-American relations. So brief reflections from panelists.
You want me to start? Sure. So I'll just tackle those together. I sort of saw it as three main questions in the end. One on liberal international order, another on Republican candidates, which is a special interest of mine, and then the third is on who's peaking and who's declining and who's done. So, this point about liberal international order, it's not as though we're not familiar with the concept. I mean, this was exactly what Trump assaulted directly and explicitly. I don't think he was familiar with it. If you asked him, he probably wouldn't know what it was. But the notion that America can promote open exchange, multilateral institutions, democracy, in a kind of virtuous cycle that continually goes up was exactly the conventional wisdom pre-Trump. And Trump wouldn't have been able, for all his flaws, he wouldn't have been able to become president had he not taken advantage of certain weaknesses in that belief system. I mean, as a matter of fact, there were problems in terms of military intervention, in terms of trade, in terms of globalization, failures, real world failures. So I think he was as much and remains a symptom as a cause of the fact that the much heralded post-Cold War liberal internationalist order did not deliver as promised for a lot of ordinary people. So until that's addressed, it's not just a matter of verbally reiterating the benefits of liberal world order. You actually have to deliver policies, and I'm sure that the Biden team knows this. They must know this, that you have to actually deliver policies that address the problem. Right? Otherwise, we're just continuing to have a kind of graduate seminar about the strengths of the liberal world order, which is not going to do it. It doesn't even work in my seminars. I mean, so it's not going to work on planet Earth. In terms of candidates on the Republican side, I mean, in a way, this is a similar challenge. I think you have, I would say, three main possibilities. One is Donald Trump. Okay. The second is Governor DeSantis of Florida, who does quite well. He polls around 30%. The third is some other candidate who currently is in the single digits. Those third category of candidates, whether it's Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, some of them worked, actually all of them worked in the Trump administration, but all of them also made it clear that they had kind of Reagan-Bush instincts on policy when you get right down to it. They have a record of being hardline on Russia. They tend to be pro-NATO. So however close they were to Trump personally in some cases, they are more sort of Reagan-Bush on policy. Trump on the other end of the spectrum has made it very clear. I'm sure you all know what his views are on Ukraine. And he's actually been, we were talking about this at dinner last night, he's actually been, for a politician, remarkably consistent in his own strange way going back 40 years. He has a point of view. His point of view is he thinks U.S. allies are free riders. Right? That's his point of view. That's not my point of view. That's his point of view. He is consistent on that. He delivered it not in venues like this, but on the Howard Stern show, and he actually has always said the same thing. And he's not going to change. He is not going to change. So if he becomes president again, which I think is possible, by the way, it's not likely, but it's possible, He will not change. He will continue to think what he has always thought, which is that. And then you have to ask yourself what happens next. So candidates what makes DeSantis interesting to my mind is, if you look at his record, I mean, he hasn't really elaborated a foreign policy worldview yet. So we're going to be very curious to see what he has to say. He's going to, at some point, have to elaborate on Ukraine specifically. This is going to be tricky, okay? Because Republicans are badly divided on Ukraine today. They weren't actually so divided a year ago. There was solid support for aid to Ukraine. As of now, there is deep division. There's a significant number of Republicans who support it. There's a significant number who oppose it. So that's something that's going to have to be worked out. You're going to be watching for that in the Republican primaries because there will be people on both sides of that issue. I will be very curious to see where DeSantis comes down. If you were just to look at DeSantis' history in Congress, he's actually fairly hawkish on issues like, again, kind of a little bit closer to the Reagan-Bush legacy, on issues like Iran, defense spending, Iraq, Afghanistan. But at the same time, there have been moments, for example, I think he was very critical in retrospect of U.S. democracy promotion efforts in Afghanistan. Even though he didn't like the humiliation of the exit, he said, the truth is that it didn't work. It didn't work. So that was not exactly what I think maybe a George W. Bush would have said. So I would say keeping a close eye on DeSantis, because other than Trump, he's the one that seems to have the best sense for Republican conservative voters and how they feel, and that's why he polls at 30% instead of 5%. He's somebody that transmits a sense that he understands how the party has changed over the last 10, 15 years, and what the issues that actually matter to voters. Now, that leads me to Donald Trump. So China's peaking, Russia's declining, and Trump is done. Maybe. It's entirely possible. As I said, I think anything's possible. I think of Trump as if you remember, maybe I'm dating myself, if you remember the heavyweight boxer Mike Tyson from circa 1996, Trump reminds me a little bit of him, right? He's extremely controversial. He bites ears. He talks trash. Maybe he'll win the next fight, maybe he won't. But on a good day, he hits very hard. And people know that. So I would not rule him out. I mean, in all seriousness, the idea that he can't possibly win the nomination, I think, is delusional. It is entirely possible he wins the nomination. He polls at 50%. Whatever's happened, however controversial, however little elite support he has at this point, he is undeniably the front runner. Okay. So if he wins the nomination, then what happens? Maybe Biden defeats him for all the obvious reasons, as he did in 2020. Maybe he doesn't, actually. So I would think seriously about, from a Finnish point of view, European point of view, what is your plan if Trump wins the presidency? Because it could happen. I'm not saying it's 51%. Actually, I think it's probably quite a bit less. But I will say to you, I actually think it's possible Donald Trump is reelected president of the United States.
I'll just really quickly comment on René's comment on the German-US relations. I think it's very interesting dynamic that's there right now with Scholz and Biden, and how the fact that Biden is so pro-European in a way as a president, and very, as I mentioned, very eager to come even further than halfway. And I think that Scholz, it has in a positive way emboldened Scholz, who is otherwise quite an indecisive and not such like from his leadership psychology, not a very decisive person. So I think that's a positive thing, and I think that Scholz has also kind of learned how to push Biden's buttons and how to get his extra voice. So this is an interesting dynamic, but of course it's not a long-term strategy. This will very likely not work with Trump, and this kind of expectation that the U.S. will all the time coordinate with Germany and take every step with Germany and so on, that could even antagonize a president like Trump, and it will obviously also not be the expectation on the German side. So it will be very interesting to see what kind of a strategy, for example, Germany develops to deal with potential Trump administration number 2, and and that will definitely change matters. I think that especially in Germany, as in some other Western European countries as well, there are these latent like anti-Americanist views as well. And in Germany, it's probably because there is this awareness of being very dependent, but also kind of resenting this dependence. And then also like very willingly immediately gloating over any any American mishaps or like mistakes and so on. So it works very well right now, but I think there is a very much the awareness that this is not the sustainable solution to the let's say German-American relations, or in general like American-European relations. So we stay nervous, I think.
I'm conscious of time, but we still have time for. Oh, Ville! I'm so sorry, Ville. I thought that you skipped your. But
No.
Oh, okay.
No, I wanted to.
Please go.
Let me know.
Apologies, Ville.
No, I'll forgive you. And I need to start by saying that this is the first time Mike Tyson has been mentioned at a FIA seminar. So, Colin, Ambassador, on the tactical multilateralism, it's really a way to sidestep inefficiencies in the multilateral system and impossibilities in the multilateral system, like say UN Security Council reform. But it's obvious that we need the US to do both. I mean, be engaged in established fora and to sort of use these tactical forums to not to sort of take away from engagement in these established fora, but to, you know, beef up commitment to multilateralism in general. But I think this tactical side it's part of this approach to great power competition as well, and the US has clearly woken up to for instance China's influence in certain established bodies as well, and now it is, as you said, answering this challenge by you know trying to staff up these organizations with Americans, which is kind of a change, because I think this was neglected and kind of is something that is also coming up with this great power competitive framing. The liberal international order obviously still, if not going strong, certainly hasn't disappeared. But, you know, as Colin's remarks already indicate, there's different readings of the liberal international order. And I think there is a sort of renegotiation or rethinking required, because the crises are, you could say they're quite fundamental. There is an authority crisis, because a lot of states who were not present at the creation, so to speak, of this order want to have their say. And there is a need for renegotiation in that sense. And then there is a crisis of governance. And what is this liberal international order delivering to the American middle class, to, you know, the Finnish middle class, citizens of the European Union? So these are quite fundamental questions where we need to think about when it comes to the liberal international order. To René's point, really quickly, on the use of communication, the intelligence, I think this is an extremely interesting new way of using, you know, the idea environment, the opportunities that this current idea environment, the swiftness of global communication presents to great powers. And I think this is an interesting new avenue in great power competition. And I think the US has learned something.
And the Chinese might learn something.
Exactly. So this might also be the case. So I guess it's it's a case of somebody comes up with something, and then somebody's going to try to up the ante in that regard. When it comes to the provision of arms, and this being kind of the U.S. big contribution to the war in Ukraine, leading from behind might not be such a bad thing. If leading from behind means, you provide the goods and somebody else does the actual kinetic side of it. So that's my take on the question.
There was one question in the front, and sorry, Ville, for misreading your signals. So the gentleman in the front, you had a question in the first row, and René, a quick comment from you before wrapping up.
I'm Luis Balduino, the ambassador of Brazil. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Oh, it's the question on how do you factor in the return of inflation on these big trends, and especially the disengagement with China. It has been said that China has done more to keep inflation low than all the central banks together. And in the case with the relation with the U.S. in particular, the huge Chinese domestic savings also helped to finance U.S. growth and middle-class consumption for a long time. And also in the 2008 crisis, the U.S. economy was on the brink of a big problem. Well, now China has peaked and probably will not have the same role again. But in any event, there is this issue. Bigger inflation may be a long-term trend now, and how this will affect all these views, especially on relation to trade and other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and a quick comment by René Nyberg.
Professor Duck, I'm very grateful for you reminding us of the possibility that Trump might not be done. I mean, it's important. It scares us, but it's important. But you missed one important thing. We have a war going on, and this war will be ended before the coming American elections. There will be something will happen on the front, and everything points to the fact that Russia is losing the war. It's lost it already, but it will lose it in a great way. So that creates a totally different situation for all of us. And what it means that there will be military consequences of the situation on the front. Well, we don't know what's going to happen.
Thank you. And then I'm asking final reflections from the panelists before we close the session.
Yeah, the point about inflation is a great one. Actually, that was supposed to be a major factor in the midterm elections in November. It really wasn't as big a factor, partly because Democrats were able to talk about Donald Trump. So that's your ability as a Democrat. You can always talk about Trump, and that tends to help Democrats. We've seen that. But yeah, inflation has, for example, practical impact on U.S. military spending. I mean, frankly, if you look at our global commitments, we're not spending as much as we should. You have to close that gap one way or the other. Inflation is a major problem when it comes to defense spending. So in my opinion, defense spending should actually be quite a bit more than it is. And unfortunately, right at the moment, we're seeing the possibility that it might be headed in the opposite direction. Just back to the point about Ukraine and Trump. So we know how Trump will position himself. He'll say that Ukraine is proof, the U.S. aid to Ukraine is proof that we're not paying enough attention to American workers at home and so on. And yes, it's entirely possible. You probably know more about this, that the war will be over by the time the American presidential election occurs, and then that issue is not a top issue in the election. So the reason that I think Trump...
It can be the top issue, but in another way.
Yeah. The reason that I think Trump could possibly be elected isn't because of the Ukraine issue, to be clear. So let me spell it out, which is, if you look at, as incredible as this seems to international observers, when you look at Trump versus Biden, the polls show they're dead even. They are dead even, okay? It is a 50-50 country where under current conditions, they're dead even. And Ukraine is not a top issue for most Americans. So all the same basic things that occur today, if you think about Biden's not that popular. He's stuck in the low 40s, which is about where Trump was. The economy isn't great. The Democrats managed to escape from this issue last November by focusing on Trump. And if he's the nominee, of course, they'll focus on him, and that could work. However, if you look at a long list of issues, the Democrats have moved well to the left of the median American voter and are not especially popular. So it is entirely possible, particularly when you factor in the Electoral College, that a plausible Republican nominee could defeat Joe Biden or any Democrat. And even Trump, as controversial as he is, has a shot. So I'm not saying, again, I want to make it very clear, I'm not saying this is most likely. I like to think in terms of possibilities, 10%, 20%, 30%. And then work on if I was playing cards and I knew that there was a 30% chance of something happening, I would take that very seriously. I would plan for that possibility. I have to tell you, in 2016, a lot of us knew intellectually that there was maybe a 30% chance of Trump beating Clinton. But we didn't take it seriously, not really. We didn't plan for it. And then next day, here we are, right? The election's over, Trump has become president of the United States. So all I'm saying is, strategic planning involves realistic planning for a range of possibilities, including the 10, 20, 30% that might not happen. I mean, if we're that careful about playing blackjack, shouldn't we be equally careful about U.S. presidential elections and what could come next?
Thank you. Okay, nothing from Ville and Minna. Okay, I really want to thank our panelists today, especially for Professor Dueck for making the journey to Finland from the US, and also thanking our audience for attending and also engaging your engagement in the discussion. And I wish you a very nice weekend and thank you.